Monday, June the 5th, 1944. A man sits at a desk somewhere on the English coast, writing by hand. He is 61 years old, slight and angular, and he is the naval commander of the largest fleet ever assembled. He writes in a private diary. He writes about the decision that has finally, irrevocably, been made. The great enterprise, he calls it. He writes that he has no illusions about the risks. He writes that success will be in the balance. And then, and at the close of the entry, we shall require all the help that God can give us. Then he puts down the pen. Then he goes to bed. Below the window and across the water, something is moving. Not the sound of one ship or a dozen. Something larger. The sound of a city displacing ocean. Diesel and salt and engine oil, the low throb of turbines carrying across the swells. Men are sick on the decks. The sea is still running rough, whitecaps on grey water under a grey sky. It's the aftermath of a 24-hour delay that kept tens of thousands of soldiers sealed in their staging camps, forbidden to write letters home, listening to wind. Tonight, finally, they are moving. From a single deck, in the dark, there is the shape of a vessel to port, the shadow of something enormous to starboard. On the horizon, more shadows still. The channel is full of shapes that seem to have no beginning and no end. Pulled back, seen from altitude, or seen on paper, it is 5,333 ships and landing craft moving through the night. 10 minesweeper lanes converge on the French coast like 10 fingers reaching toward the same shore. The man who put them there has just prayed for God's help. His name is Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, Naval Commander-in-Chief, Allied Expeditionary Force. The title carries almost nothing of who he is or what this moment cost him. The answer requires going back, across this same water, and 4 years earlier, to understand what kind of man writes a prayer on the eve of the largest fleet in history. It is May 1940. The British Army is on a beach at Dunkirk, and it is running out of time. German armored columns have broken through the Allied lines with a speed that neither side fully anticipated. 338,000 British and French soldiers are pinned against the English Channel. The equipment is abandoned. The ports are burning. As the question is no longer whether France can be held. The question is whether the men can be saved. In a room carved into the chalk cliffs of Dover, a room that had been used for ammunition storage and smelled of it, a rear admiral named Bertram Ramsay is working the telephones. He has been brought out of retirement 8 months earlier. He is assembling every vessel he can find: fishing boats, pleasure craft, ferries, river launches, paddle steamers, not any hull that can cross the channel and come back with men aboard. The fleet Britain has available for this rescue is not a fleet in any military sense of the word. It is a country reaching into its harbors and pulling out whatever floats. They bring 338,000 men home. Britain fights on. Through the summer, the Luftwaffe pounds its airfields and cities. Through 1941, convoys cross the Atlantic under U-boat assault. The Royal Navy loses ships it cannot quickly replace. So through 1942 and into 1943, Anglo-American forces grind through North Africa and Sicily and into Italy. Important campaigns, costly campaigns, but peripheral to the war that will decide everything. The war for Northwest Europe. The men commanding this effort are shaped by it. They are not theorists. They understand logistics not as an abstraction, but as the difference between survival and catastrophe. They have learned this under fire, on beaches, in deserts, at sea. By late 1943, that knowledge is in their bones. And by late 1943, the clock is ticking. At Tehran in November, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin lock in the decision there will be a cross-channel invasion of France in 1944. The question is no longer whether. The question is how large. And the answer depends on something none of these British officers yet fully grasps. It depends on what America has been building. By the spring of 1944, the south of England no longer resembles the south of England. And every field, every road, every harbour is part of a military machine. Tanks sit in forest clearings under camouflage netting. Landing craft crowd the estuaries by the hundred. The roads through Devon and Cornwall carry convoys that seem to have no end. Approximately 1.5 million Americans are staged in the United Kingdom, in camps shaped like sausages on the maps, sealed and classified, and more are arriving. The ordinary British subject has a phrase for this. The Americans are overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. The comedian Tommy Trinder has been getting laughs from it for months, and the laughter is real because the irritation is real. American enlisted men earn several times the pay of their British counterparts. They have cigarettes and chocolate and a confidence that reads, to a population that has been bombed and rationed for 4 years, as something close to provocation. But the British generals are doing different arithmetic. They're standing at planning tables in London and Portsmouth. They're adding up what they can see accumulating along the coast. Admiral Ramsay is coordinating vessels from 8 different navies, planning mine-sweeping lanes, timing bombardment sequences. He has run complex naval operations before, Torch, Sicily, but nothing resembles what he is looking at now. Bernard Montgomery, Ground Forces Commander, moves through planning conferences with his characteristic studied informality. The beret, the open collar, the caravan that serves as personal quarters even at senior headquarters, and watches the American machine grow. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, is examining the proposed airborne component of the operation, and he is afraid. 3 men, 3 ways of receiving the same accumulation of power. December 31st, 1943. Eisenhower and Montgomery examine the invasion plan for the first time. And it has been drawn up by Cossack, the planning body established to produce an initial blueprint. What the 2 men see is this: 3 divisions, a 25-mile front, 2 more divisions in support. Both reject it immediately. History will later construct Montgomery as the cautious general, the man of painstaking preparation, of deliberate advance, of opportunities narrowed into certainties. A pace that will frustrate American commanders throughout the summer of 1944. And that general will exist. He will still be provoking arguments in 1958 from the pages of inflammatory memoirs criticizing Eisenhower, by then the President of the United States, and he will damage his own standing more thoroughly than any enemy ever managed. But on December 31st, 1943, Montgomery looks at the Cossack plan and says, it is not big enough. He demands 5 assault divisions, 3 airborne divisions, a 50-mile front, and he pushes for the full weight of what Allied production can provide. Because he has done the arithmetic, and he understands that the arithmetic has fundamentally changed. A landing on a fortified coast demands every available division, every available vessel. The plan must be as large as the resources allow. The expansion requires landing craft that haven't yet been allocated. The decision pushes the invasion from May to June. The landing craft are delivered. So this is what British ore actually looked like. Not a speech. Not a theatrical moment on a harbour wall. A general who had spent 4 years fighting with whatever Britain could scrape together, looking at what America could provide and saying, more. We can have more. We must take more. Lee Mallory delivers a different verdict. In private correspondence to Eisenhower, so he warns that the proposed night airborne drops onto the Cotentin Peninsula could produce casualties of 70 to 80%. Possibly 30,000 men dead or captured before a single soldier sets foot on a beach. He urges cancellation. Eisenhower reads the warning and overrules him. The drops will proceed. He may be wrong in magnitude. June 6th will not produce the slaughter he predicts, but it will come closer than anyone would like. And the gap between his fear and the outcome is narrower than the numbers suggest. Then there is the figure that puts everything else into perspective. Admiral Ernest King has allocated American landing craft to Operation Neptune. His allocation is 2,493 vessels. He controls 31,123. The largest fleet in history represents less than 8% of the landing craft the United States has built and deployed. 12 times this many American vessels exist and are operating elsewhere, primarily in the Pacific. The men who spent 4 years doing more with less than they needed are now assembling a historically unprecedented fleet from a fraction of one country's available inventory. That number, less than 8%, is the clearest measure of what has happened to the balance of the world between Dunkirk and D-Day. The men assembling this fleet do not know what is happening on the other side. See, they know a great deal. German division positions, coastal battery locations, Atlantic wall construction depths, tidal windows at Normandy. They know the Germans expect an invasion, and they have spent enormous effort through Operation Bodyguard, through a phantom army nominally commanded by Patton, through false radio signals pointing toward Pas-de-Calais, making certain the Germans cannot know where. It works. On June 6th, named the bulk of German defensive forces are 150 miles from Normandy, waiting for an assault at Calais that will not come. But the deeper German reality is something Allied intelligence cannot see because it is not a matter of troop positions. It is a matter of internal collapse. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, will later write that in early June 1944, the German High Command was holding conferences about distant defensive requirements, while the homeland itself could barely be defended. His private conclusion: if Allied airborne forces had seized the major northern ports, landing armies coming in by sea would have met almost nothing standing between them and Berlin. Germany was already that hollow. The British generals who had spent 4 years fighting toward this moment were launching against a regime that privately could not defend its own industrial heartland from a secondary thrust. They could not know this. They went in certain they might fail. And then there is the matter of the Panzer Reserves. Rommel and Rundstedt have argued for months about where to position the armored forces that represent Germany's only genuine counter to a landing. Now, Rommel wants them close to the beaches, stop the invasion at the waterline before Allied naval guns dominate the battle. Rundstedt wants them held back, concentrated, committed only when the main landing is confirmed. Hitler decides neither. He splits the reserves between them and retains personal authority to release the central formation. On June 6th, that reserve cannot move without Hitler's personal order. Hitler is asleep. His staff will not wake him. And the panzer divisions that might have driven the landings back into the sea sit in their assembly areas through the morning and into the afternoon, awaiting authorization that does not arrive in time. Ramsey cannot know this. Montgomery cannot plan for it. It is fortune operating in the space between what the planners control and what they don't. There is one place where Allied intelligence fails in the other direction, and Montgomery has designated Caen as a D-Day objective, to be taken on June 6th itself. What Allied intelligence has not detected is that the 21st Panzer Division is already positioned in its vicinity, waiting. Caen will not fall for weeks. Not everything breaks your way. The minesweepers go first. In the darkness of June 5th, 10 teams clear 10 lanes through the channel, marking safe passage with buoys. The fleet follows, ship after ship in single file, navigating by instrument and by the running lights of the vessel ahead. It takes all night. Just before midnight, 1,200 aircraft depart England heading south. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions drop onto the Cotentin Peninsula in darkness. British 6th Airborne drops east of the Orne. Only around 15% of paratroopers land in the correct location. Lee Mallory's predicted slaughter does not materialize, but the chaos is real. The men come down miles from their objectives, alone in Norman fields, fighting in small groups in the dark with no reliable sense of where they are. The flanks hold, and not because the drops go as planned. The Germans on the ground are themselves disoriented, uncertain whether this is the main invasion or one more feint in a deception that has been running for months. Later, Lee Mallory will write Eisenhower a private letter acknowledging he was wrong. He was wrong in magnitude, and the rest of it was closer than either man could have wished. At 5:45 in the morning, the naval guns open. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the full weight of years of Allied production aimed at concrete the Atlantic Wall's designers considered permanent. Then, at 5:10, the German Navy responds. 3 torpedo boats emerge from the east. They launch 15 torpedoes at the Eastern Task Force. One finds its target, the Norwegian destroyer Svena, off Sword Beach. So then the torpedo boats turn and flee into a smokescreen laid by the RAF. 3 torpedo boats. 1 ship sunk, then they run. The landings proceed. At Utah, the current carries the assault craft south by accident into a sector with lighter defenses. The landing goes better than planned. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadians pay a cost that is terrible but bearable. At Omaha, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions land an hour ahead of the British schedule, which means 40 minutes of naval bombardment instead of longer. The bombers assigned to the German bunkers release their loads too far inland, unwilling to risk hitting the approaching craft below. The bunkers survive intact when the infantry hits the water. At least 10,000 Allied soldiers are killed or wounded before June 6th ends. Late in the afternoon, Major General Clarence Hubner, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, comes ashore at Omaha and sends a message back to 1st Army Commander Omar Bradley aboard the Augusta. Thank God for the United States Navy. By nightfall, more than 160,000 Allied troops are ashore. The wall has been breached. The verdict on what happened between June 6, 1944 and the end of the war in Europe requires years to fully assemble. When it is assembled, it reads as follows. The invasion of northern France was the most significant victory of the Western Allies in the war. And the German army suffered a catastrophe greater than Stalingrad, greater than North Africa. The Spear account explains part of why. Germany was already hollow when the landing craft touched the beach. The hollowness was invisible from the outside, but it had been building for years, and the men who crossed the channel in the dark did not know they were striking a structure closer to collapse than they feared. Lee Mallory's 80% casualty prediction did not come to pass, and he wrote Eisenhower his private letter of acknowledgement. He was wrong in magnitude, and the airborne chaos was real enough that the question of how wrong is one the historical record still sits with uncomfortably. He never had time to understand how close it had been. On November 14, 1944, his transport aircraft crashes in the French Alps en route to a new command in Southeast Asia. The liberation of Europe takes place without him. Montgomery commands through the summer, and through the hard fighting in the hedgerows and the long slugging match outside Caen, through the breakout and the pursuit across France, through the difficult winter and into 1945. On May 4th, on Lüneburg Heath, he accepts the surrender of all German forces in northwestern Europe. He outlives the war. He outlives most of his generation. In 1958, he publishes his memoirs. They are inflammatory by any standard, critical of Eisenhower's judgment, critical of American strategy, critical enough of a sitting president to damage Montgomery's own standing for the remainder of his life. The man who understood American industrial power better than almost any British officer of his era never quite stopped condescending toward the country that produced it. And then there is Ramsay. He manages the logistics of Neptune through the consolidation and the breakout, coordinating the continuous movement of men, vehicles, and material across the channel as the Allied foothold expands into a front. On January 2nd, 1945, 6 months after the fleet crosses the channel, he boards an aircraft near Paris en route to a meeting with Montgomery in Brussels. The aircraft crashes shortly after takeoff near Toussaint-le-Noble. He is 61 years old. The war has 5 months left to run. He never writes his memoirs. He leaves behind his charts and his operational records and his career, and one handwritten diary, held at the Churchill Archives Centre in Cambridge. The diary sits unpublished for 50 years. In 1994, it appears in print. The entry for June 5th, 1944 is the one that matters. And the man who organized Dunkirk with fishing boats and paddle steamers, who commanded the largest fleet in the history of naval warfare, who had spent 4 years learning to do more with less before finding himself in charge of something he could not have imagined in 1940, sat down in the quiet before midnight and wrote what he actually thought. Not for the record, for himself, alone, on the eve of everything. He did not write about the 6,939 vessels. And he did not write about the 8 navies or the 10 minesweeper lanes or the battleships lined up in the dark. He wrote that success would be in the balance. He wrote that they would need their invisible assets. And then, at the end of the entry, the line that waited 50 years to be read: "We shall require all the help that God can give us." He received it partly from the Americans, who had 12 times more of these vessels and deployed most of them elsewhere, not partly from a deception operation that kept the German reserves 150 miles away, partly from a dictator who had structured his command so that his own staff was afraid to wake him on the morning the world changed. Ramsay couldn't know any of that. He knew what he had built. He knew the weight of what might still go wrong. He knew what it meant to stand at the edge of what might be possible and remain uncertain whether it would be enough. The fleet was real. The power was real. Even the prayer, written by hand in the dark, was real too. The man who crossed this water once with fishing boats, who crossed it again with 6,939 vessels, sat alone in a room with a pen and a diary and prayed. He never got to write about what came after.